few basics about the webinar. Michael, can you talk about how they can post questions and that type of thing?
Yes, if you're connected by the computer, there's a chat function on your control panel down near the bottom. You can type in a question there at any time during Susan's presentation, and we'll flag that for her to answer. If you're not connected by computer and you're only listening by telephone, your only real option is going to be to just kind of interrupt and say, "Excuse me, I have a question," and then state your name and your question. Otherwise, we'll go from there. Like Susan said, please try to stay muted, just so we delete background noise and interference.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know a few of you have introduced yourself. If anyone else would like to introduce themselves, we'd love to hear who you are and where you're from.
Mike Duranick from Indiana.
Great, welcome. Anybody else? All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. What we're going to talk today about is boundary violations. And when I talk about boundary violations, what we're talking about is inappropriate relationships between staff and offenders, inmates, residents, whatever you call them in your jurisdiction. Now, boundary violations are not just when employees have sex with inmates, although that certainly is a boundary violation. But it also includes when employees cross that line, and we're going to talk about that continuum. Boundary violations can be an emotional violation where we have just said too much about our private life in front of an inmate, or maybe even had a conversation with that inmate. All the way up to the extreme other end of that continuum is, of course, sex. It's criminal acts, it's facilitating escapes, it's facilitating assaults, or even worse. So that's kind of the other end of boundary violations. So when we talk about boundary violations, a lot of times we focus on that end of it. My contention is we are never going to fix that end of it without fixing the more gray area, or the less severe end of it. Our interventions have to start. Because I don't know about you, but I have never heard of anybody engaging with sex with an inmate that didn't also have private conversations with them before, that didn't also have touching, that didn't also have all these other less severe, maybe bringing in food, whatever it is. And of course, I'm saying him. The reality is that most of the time when we're talking about boundary violations in this country, we are talking about female staff having inappropriate sex, in particular with male inmates. So most of our data is really about female staff and male inmates, but all of us listening, I'm sure, know that you've had cases, I'm sure, in your district as well as my home district of Colorado, where it's been involved a male staff member and a female inmate, or a male staff member and a male inmate, a female staff member and a female inmate. So this is not just about women working in corrections who have crossed the line with male inmates, but it is, from the data we have, the majority of the cases. Now, again, remember those cases that are being reported through the PREA statistics are about that sexual boundary. We don't have any good data, and if you guys have any, I would love to hear about it, that talks about all those less severe boundary violations. Those kinds of things don't exist on a national level. They may exist within your agency if a pretty significant boundary was crossed, such as perhaps bringing in contraband, or bringing in food items, or bringing in pieces of a weapon or a whole weapon. But I don't think we have any data anywhere that talks about those less severe boundary violations, just sharing too much, just developing an emotional attachment to each other. Those types of things are not measured anywhere that I know of. So when we talk about boundary violations, it's easy to see the headlines. And these are a few years old, and we could add to them. I certainly should have put Dana Mora from New York State on there. That's my oversight. But in Kansas, several years ago, an escapee benefited from outside help. Some of you may know details about that particular incident, but it ended up, I believe it was New Mexico or Oklahoma, where they captured them after a shootout with the former staff member. Tennessee, of course, one of the most tragic, where an officer was killed as an inmate escaped. I believe it was on a court transport. And Maryland, about 3 or 4 years ago, where 13 officers were indicted who were accused of aiding gangs and their drug scheme. They were also later accused of having children that were the father were inmates within their jurisdiction. So these are some of the headlines. And of course, like I said, I should have added Dannemora. You can't hardly have a boundary violations conversation without talking about what happened in New York, and I believe it was 2014. By the way, if any of you are interested, there's a documentary out about Dannemora now. It's called We Stand Corrected. And it's a different perspective. It's from the officers who were not involved in the escape and who were not involved in the administration of the New York Department of Corrections, but it's from their point of view. And it's kind of an interesting watch. You can get it on Prime Video, I think, for free, or you can pay for it, I'm sure, through Prime too. But it's kind of a neat, different perspective when you talk about boundary violations. So I encourage you, if you're developing curriculum, if you want to know more about this, if you want to just understand this a little bit more, I really encourage you to watch that too. We Stand Corrected. So from a training perspective, let me tell you a little bit about me, because this next slide, who's to blame each time an employee is walked out? Well, training is to blame, right? Obviously, the trainer didn't do their job. Obviously, the trainer didn't tell our staff not to have sex with inmates, not to help them escape, not to help them orchestrate violence, whatever it is. Now, I say this not from, well, I'm also from experience of being the administrator, but I started out in corrections in Colorado, worked myself up to the rank of lieutenant, where I was given the opportunity to be one of our first training coordinators. Now, we had training coordinators before, but this was kind of a revisiting, a reestablishment of a system-wide training program in the 90s. So I was given the opportunity to establish that, to develop it, and I found out that I loved doing training. So from that point on, at the level of lieutenant, up until when I retired at the level of warden, I did training. I developed curriculum, not full-time, of course, after I got started, after I promoted out of that lieutenant rank, but it was always a key part of who I was. Even up to 2 weeks before I retired, I did my last training program for instructors in Colorado. So when I talk about training, yes, I was a warden, yes, I was an officer, and yes, I was a training coordinator in the middle there. And so I have 3 different perspectives, but my true passion, if you will, because of course I'm now retired and I'm still doing this, my true passion is training. And seeing issues and conditions and then concerns and corrections through the trainer's eye is like my first fallback. It's the first thing I think of. So each time an employee walked out, the trainee is to blame because we did something wrong. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's the message I personally have received, and I hope it's not a message I ever communicated. Because when we talk about training, when we talk about boundary violations, I've never had anyone break a serious boundary such as sex or criminal acts with anyone and tell me that no one ever told them it was against the rules. Has anyone ever had that happen where someone actually said, I had no idea I wasn't supposed to do this? So it's not about the training curriculum, and we're going to talk a lot more about training cannot be the only response to this issue in a few minutes. The other thing that happens, oh, I'm sorry, I kind of mentioned this already, but I want to go back to it. Guerino and Beck are 2 people that have done a lot of data for PREA, a lot of data analysis for PREA. And one of the data analyses they've done, and it's from 2007 and 2008, and we do not have an updated number on this particular statistic. They found that 46% of all substantiated incidents of inmates who were sexually victimized, all inmates were victimized either by inmates or by staff. 46% involve staff with inmates. That's almost half. But then look at the next one. Of that number, 61% involve female employees. Now, this is shocking. The first time I heard this, I was, as a female employee of corrections, right? I was like someone had kicked me in the gut. But you have to also remember that well over 90% or 95%, considering your jurisdiction, are male inmates. So when you're talking about the pool of who we have boundary violations with, obviously male inmates outnumber female inmates, what is that, 9-to-1 or whatever. And of course, the data we don't have much on is same-sex violations. You don't have to be around male inmates for female staff to have boundary violation. Same-sex violations also happen, but they're not being reported even through PREA with the frequency that one would expect to find it. And if I say that, one would expect to find it because just reflecting on my career, I can think of a handful of those incidents, and yet none of them are really showing up with any degree of statistical significance in the data yet. So I think that's one of those pieces that will come eventually, maybe when people are more comfortable talking about all the different kinds of relationships, abuses that may be involved with inmates. So training is the problem. It's also the second piece. So it's training in HR who's really the problem, right? Is this just about hiring the wrong person? I have said this hundreds of times in my career. I have pontificated probably to the director of HR and blamed him for the people he was sending me. Because some of the boundary violations didn't include sex, some of them included contraband or setting up assaults, that type of thing, right? Well, it must be, you know, look at who you're giving me to be an officer. And so it isn't about the wrong person. So in the research that I've conducted on this, I started looking at this. Is it an individual bad apple type thing, or is it something else? And this is just from the people I've met and heard stories about around the country. This is not just from Colorado, but some of the people that have crossed boundaries that have led to them leaving corrections and some of them even being prosecuted for criminal acts. One was 25 years a case manager, 8 years an administrative assistant, 2 years an officer, 10 years a captain, 8 years a teacher. So if we're hiring the wrong person, shouldn't this all be people with 6 months or a year or less? How do you hire the wrong person and they're the right person for 24.5 years before they cross the boundary? So that didn't make any sense. Now, I'm not saying that's not a piece of it because I believe it is a piece of it, but it can't be the whole answer. So then I looked at background. Well, they're not prepared to do this job. So I looked at these kinds of things. We had people with bachelor's degree in criminal justice. How much more prepared are you going to get than that, education-wise? We had people with high school diplomas, people that grew up in corrections families, that knew the culture, that had lived in Prison Central, wherever that is in your location. You probably have examples of that. Prior law enforcement, prior corrections, prior military. Again, if this is the wrong person, or if it's because these people aren't being adequately trained or adequately prepared for this work, why are we seeing this kind of diversity? Does anyone have anything they want to add to these two lists? I'm going to back up. Do you have any comments anybody want to make on this? Okay, so in my research, and backing up just a little bit, I started as an officer in the 80s in Colorado. After I worked at community corrections for 4 years, I was a trainer in the middle of that, and I retired at the level of warden. And most of the time I was the warden, I was running our Supermax facilities in Colorado. After I retired, I completed one of my lifelong goals and completed the requirements and was awarded a PhD, conferred a PhD out of the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. My dissertation work was on boundary violations. And as a part of that, I developed this boundary violation model to help me understand and try to get other corrections people to understand a piece of this and how this works. So this is the boundary violation model, and we're going to go through it a piece at a time. And we'll come back to that, so you don't have to have that memorized or screenshotted. The first piece of this is this prison town. And I define a prison town, which is a town where the history, the culture, and the economic fabric is so intertwined with that of the prison that you can't tell them apart. Canyon City, Colorado is a prison town in Colorado. I know there are other prison towns throughout the country, but Denver, Colorado has 2 major prisons in it. And it's certainly, I mean, you could ask people on the street, most of the people you run into don't even know a prison exists. So when you talk about this prison town as this context for this model, is I'm talking about the culture. I'm talking about where the prison ends and you go into the community, and community members working at a restaurant or Walmart or Quick Stop or whatever know a lot about what goes on at the prison, not just that they exist out there. So it's that culture that goes into the community. Within the prison town, then, is the corrections culture. And 3 of the things I think are really important when it comes to boundaries is these 3 statements. One is there's this myth of rigid boundaries, meaning that you treat all inmates the same way, and everybody knows what that way is, and if you don't know it, you're too stupid and you should work somewhere else. Now, I say rigid boundaries is a myth because it's my experience, both in Colorado and talking to people from around the country, that isn't really the way we do things. How we treat inmates in a supermax facility who are locked down 23 hours a day is dramatically different than how that teacher at minimum security is expected to interact with their inmates, the assigned people in their classrooms. How we treat inmates on a work detail that goes into the community, again, dramatically different than how we treat inmates at the other end of that extreme. Again, I'll use supermax as that extreme. So there's this idea in training, we're guilty of this. Lots of training curriculums are guilty of this. Rarely do we talk about these differences, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Inmate relationships are a non-fixable problem, and we can't ask for help. That's another component of the culture. If you are stupid enough to get involved with in a relationship with an inmate, even if you haven't broken any laws, there's any touching going on, you haven't brought in contraband, you haven't had sex, if you're stupid enough to develop feelings for inmates, then you can't ask for help. We don't allow it, because if you come to me and say, I've developed feelings for this inmate, maybe it's someone I went to high school with, and maybe it's someone I even dated. That happened in one of my experiences with staff. And there's a relationship there. And we move that inmate, for instance, or sometimes you move the staff member, depending on what the situation is. We are never really going to trust you again. And the next time something comes up, you're going to be the first person on our suspicion spectrum. So I call it a non-fixable problem. Our culture says it is a non-fixable problem. I don't want you to hang up now, the webinar is open, or there's nothing we can do about it, because I do think there's stuff we can do about it. Our culture says it is a non-fixable problem. And then the third one there is this DOC family. I have never been to an event that recognizes staff, whether it's training academy graduations or something else, where somebody doesn't say, welcome to the family or something like that. And they talk about, we're a family, we're here for each other, we have your back. And that's kind of that culture that is part of the problem, because when someone gets involved with an inmate, we don't have their back. They turn their back on us. And so we kick them out, either physically or emotionally or socially. Usually we kick them out socially and emotionally very, very early on when we think there's something brewing. So it's these 3 pieces of the corrections culture that directly impact the rest of this model. So now we're going to go into that next box, which is the actual prison environment inside the walls. And the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of social identity. You know, you've probably worked with people that didn't really fit in, right? That didn't really belong in this business, that when they got here, especially as a trainer, you're thinking, oh my gosh, they're not going to make it a year. And when they don't make it a year, I hope they don't get someone else hurt in the process. That's an idea of social identity. We don't really fit. I had a former employee tell me once, she said that she wasn't like me. Obviously, this was a conversation that was not going to end well for her. And then she went on to say she was really too nice to work in a prison. And while I took offense to that, obviously, I thought about that social identity. What she's really saying is she's not like the rest of us. She can't be stoic. She can't create that boundary. She can't be what in her opinion was rude. to inmates when they asked her about her personal life. Because when people ask you questions like that in the community, you don't tell them it's none of your business and get back in line or whatever else. That would be rude. And so she didn't really fit into this environment. She may have understood it emotionally or intellectually, but she didn't buy it emotionally. Another statement I saw in a recent article in Corrections One that I thought really speaks to this. We cling to old traditions and practices, rites of passage, even in the job place, which leave coworkers to fend for themselves until they've proven themselves worthy of being included. Does that ring true to any of you? Anyone want to provide a comment on that?
I would just say, yeah, we've heard from some of our staff when we try to interview them 60 days in or 90 days in to see how orientation's going. We hear something similar from them or have in the past, and we've been trying to address it.
And how do you address it? What do you do with that?
Well, it's not easy because a lot of it, I think, comes from, you know, your experienced staff saying, well, this is how it was for me and I survived. So you've got to have just real transparent discussions with staff at every level about the negative impact that has on your culture and the risk it creates.
Right. You know, my husband started in corrections 5 years before I did. And before I came to work, I was in community corrections at that point. He was within the prison system. And he told me he was told, not implied, he was told once that nobody wanted to hear anything he said till he'd been there a year. And I thought, oh my gosh. And that was from the early 80s, right? But do we say that? And it sounds like we do kind of say that. Maybe not that in those words anymore, but we still kind of imply that. So that gets back to that social identity. And then, like in my husband's case, for the people that didn't make it a year or didn't keep their mouth shut for a year, what happens to them? Do they leave the work? Well, yes, they do, but they also maybe create some problems for us before they leave. So the next thing I want to talk about within that model is boundaries. They're really inconsistent and unclear. If you have, let's say you're teaching a brand new group of people. How do you stand up in front of that brand new group of people and say, this is the way we deal with inmates? They are not all alike because your role, their security level, their job assignment, their whatever, makes a difference in how we treat them. Well, that's a lot more complex of a training curriculum than what we use now. Firm, fair, and consistent, right? Every inmate should be treated that way. You don't tell any inmate anything. You don't develop relationships with any inmate. But then we send people like teachers or nurses into our corrections facilities. And part of their formal education on developing their job skills talks about relationship. It talks about rapport. So we're really kind of speaking out of both ends of our mouth. We really expect them to figure it out. But we never really say, it's different. It's based on where you're at least that's my perspective. Now, hopefully a few things have changed and some of your training maybe has developed around this. I have to give you an example of this that really struck home. After I retired, many of you may remember that our executive director was murdered by an inmate that had been released directly out of Supermax. His funeral was televised, at least locally, and anyone, you know, through 3 different TV stations could watch the funeral going on. And during that funeral, it was pretty unique. He had a different philosophy. Even though the rules hadn't changed, the rules still said you can have no contact with ex-offenders while they're on parole. And then for either 3 or 7 years after that, our rule changed down to 3 at some point, but at one point it was 7 years. No contact. And if you do have contact with them, then you have to file a report each and every time that happens. That was the rule. That was the rule that he signed even before he was murdered. Yet in his funeral, there was at least 3 different ex-offenders, 1 on parole still. 1 talked about being at his house for dinner. 1 part talked about being at church events with him that he had encouraged and reached out to them. And I could go on and on just watching this funeral. And so what I took from that, it was right at the same time I was defending my dissertation on this, talking about timing is everything. What I thought is, oh my gosh, this is really an inconsistent message. And for our staff to see that televised, you know, there's 4 or 5 things that happened that was part of the testimony and the memorial from Mr. Clements that would have gotten them fired. And there was a lot of talk about that. I was in Canyon City at the time that all this was happening. And there was a lot of talk about that, like, and it really brought home this point of inconsistency. It depends on your role. Now, I'm not saying those things were appropriate or inappropriate. I'm not going to cast judgment on that. I'm just saying that if it had been anyone else, they would have been written up and potentially terminated for those same exact kinds of relationships. So it really brings home this idea about inconsistency, and we're unclear. And staff then after that, especially, we're kind of muddling around. The other thing, have any of you seen about 6 months or a year ago, the article that came out of Colorado again? And I use Colorado because of course I know these people, but it's not, this isn't just happening in Colorado. Our new director has implemented a normalization policy. And we're trying to normalize life within prison in the hopes that it will improve outcomes when people get out. And there was an incident up at Sterling at one of our northeastern edge of the state where 3 staff members, I believe it was, allowed themselves to be picked up by inmates and thrown into dunk tanks. Did anybody see that? Now, it's easy to say again, oh my gosh, what's wrong with those 3 people? But none of those 3 people, female staff that were thrown into dunk tanks, were new. None of them were particularly vulnerable from what I know about them, and I can't say I know them all personally. But it's about this inconsistent. We changed the policy to normalization. Well, what does that mean? It's this inconsistency that really kind of drives it home. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that. I digressed a little bit. The other thing that's really important, Gresham Sykes wrote the Society of Captives in the 50s, I believe it was 57. And it is a staple for anyone that's ever taken a criminal justice class. It is still talked about. I can only hope that anything I might write or say will still be talked about in 60, 70 years, right? But he talked about this culture of reciprocity. And what that means is we depend upon inmates to get our job done. We depend upon inmates to keep the peace. We depend upon inmates, maybe the power players or whatever, to deal with an issue before we have to deal with it. So now you have this inconsistent boundaries, maybe because of a change of policy. And now you've got the reality of our job, and we rarely talk about this at basic training. At least I rarely talked about it all the years I did basic training classes. This idea that sometimes, especially in lower level facilities, we have to have cooperation from inmates to get our job done. So that you cannot talk about this conversation without understanding this idea of reciprocity. Now, the most controversial part of this model for a lot of people is power. Inmates' source of power differed. And what that means is we have some inmates who have more power than other inmates. And this is the part that gets caught in everyone's craw a lot of times. We have some inmates that have more power than some of our staff. Now think about that. We don't like to hear it. Every time I say it, I feel like this queasiness in my stomach. Even just now, I've been retired for 7 years, and saying that upsets me still. But looking back on instances I've heard about around the country, we have had inmates who had more power than staff. We've had staff tell me that when they wrote up a particular inmate for a relatively medium to low level violation, they were in trouble because that inmate wasn't held to the same standard. Maybe it's because of who that inmate's related to. Maybe it's because of how much time that inmate's done. A lot of our old timers have relationships with staff that go back a long time. And sometimes they have relationships with staff that are at higher ranks now. Maybe the current major was the officer on their unit when they first came in. And they've kept their nose clean. They maybe helped us out a couple times or two. Maybe it's because of who they have developed those relationships with. So this idea that inmates can have more power than some of our officers is crucial to understanding this. Then the next one shouldn't surprise anyone. It says personal relationship vulnerability. You don't have to drive across the street to figure out that when people are going through divorces or their spouses are perhaps having affairs, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or maybe, you know, they're going through a divorce, or may maybe it's children, maybe they lost a family member, whatever it is, they're vulnerable. We're all vulnerable when those things happen. And inmates watch us, they know when those things happen, and they take advantage of it. Now, looking back at this model, we're going to talk about that circle in the middle. And that circle in the middle is the search for connection. Think about those people that are working in those isolated posts who don't see a staff member except at roll call. It's about connection. Who are they connecting with? Maybe it's by computer now, maybe it's by phone or radio, but a lot of times they're connecting with their porters, their janitors in their particular areas, their students in their classrooms. So when people move away from us into a relationship with an inmate, they're moving toward something most of the time. And it's important to look at this idea of propinquity. The physical proximity and functional distance between people matters. Who we're around matters who we develop a relationship with. Now, in the age of internet and social media and online dating and everything else, you could still use the same term even for those kinds of relationships. But the physical proximity and functional distance between people matters on who we develop relationships with. So, organizational implications. Rather than attributing boundary violations to individual failure, we have some responsibility. The organizational response aimed at preventing boundary violations of employees needs to be examined by corrections leaders. Now, when I talk about corrections leaders, I think of trainers as correction leaders. I mean, who else stands up in front of groups of people all the time and imparts wisdom or whatever? We certainly don't just, at least I've never seen a situation where you stick just to the curriculum every time and you never see a single word that hasn't been pre-printed or pre-approved. So we're leaders. And when we talk about this organizational response, it has to be more than training. Now, training and preparation has to include inmate manipulation, and we're really good at that. Everybody probably has a lesson plan that talks about games criminals play, manipulation, downing a duck, whatever you guys call it. But inmate manipulation, we're pretty good at. But this other piece, the actual human connections we're going to make in this work that include connecting with inmates, have got to be part of the discussion. And I'm going to get back to the organization in just a minute, but let's go on with training for a minute. So preparing employees for an environment where they may be manipulated by inmates is important, but the actual human connections that exist within the facilities between inmates and employees must be acknowledged and discussed. So think about your curriculum, and I really hope, and if you don't want to jump in now, I really hope some of your curriculum is starting to go there, talking about actual human connections and how you deal with them. Again, what we can learn from Dannemora, as well as many of those other examples I talked about with the headlines, is about this actual human connection. May also be really telling on personal relationship vulnerability too. So what have we tried in training and in policy and corrections? Now, I'm saying this from my own personal experience over 20, 30 years in Colorado. The first thing we did was we tried to scare people. If you do cross this line, we will not only fire you, we will prosecute you, we will imprison you, you will lose your family, you will lose your finances, on and on and on. And even if we don't find out, that inmate dang sure is going to take all your money, right? So scare tactics, threaten with criminal prosecution, threaten with losing your job, threaten with losing your standing in the community too. Ridicule. Have any of you developed lesson plans on this that talk about that ridicule stuff? I'm ashamed to say I have. Back to that, how could you be so stupid, right? I did this and I survived and I never had sex with an inmate. So ridicule, we've tried. Real life examples. Most people listening to this have tried real life examples, real life case studies. We even had a jurisdiction that had recorded phone calls they used in training to show how this relationship developed. Just the facts. You know, we told you don't have sex with inmates, you did it. It's just the way it is. Just the facts. Scenario practice. Hopefully we're doing some of that. And hopefully we're doing it in a way that isn't based on ridicule, scare, and threatening, but it's actually based on how does this happen? But we'll get back to that. Role playing, same thing, and mentorship. Now, we have had mentorship programs at different parts in my career, and without exception, each time we implemented this, it went away in a hurry because the mentoring relationship ended up to be a negative thing and actually played into some kind of malfeasance or misconduct. Hopefully some of you out there have had a little bit better luck than my experience with this. So what training actually works? I've told you all the things that don't work, right? So we don't know what training works because I don't know about you, but it's been my experience is we don't let any particular training go on long enough to measure it to see if it works. We may have a brand new curriculum and then somebody else gets walked out on this particular issue. And this is on every issue in training really, but on this particular issue. So we have a brand new curriculum, someone gets walked out, and now we're like, we have to rewrite training. So we never really measure it, usually because we don't let it go on long enough. So what can work? Whatever training we implement for boundary violations has to address the culture, has to address that idea that we're not worthy to be spoken to for a year, we're not worthy, whatever. We have to get to the cultural implications. It also has to be training that's communicated by leaders. And I don't mean the leader has to be the trainer. And we in Colorado have certainly done that. When we were dealing with workplace harassment and sexual harassment in the 90s, wardens had to present that class, right? So, and that's certainly an option. But more than that, it has to be talked about by the leaders outside of training. How many of you have gone to training? It's great, you're empowered, especially as trainers, you're back, you're going to instruct it, it's going to be great. But it's never talked about outside the classroom. It has to be communicated in the daily actions of people who have power. This idea that we're going to change the culture, that we're going to change that hazing, that shunning that happens when we first get here, all those things have to happen more than just in training. And it has to reflect the reality of the workplace. The changes are the changes that are needed. What's really different out there that we're going to start doing differently today. Now, this can't happen. Training can't have any success if we aren't changing the culture, if the organization isn't on board, if it's not being addressed by the leaders. So the organizational implications is we have to move away from attributing this entirely to individual failure. Now, don't get me wrong, individual failure is a piece of this. It just cannot be the whole answer because it's not working. If it was just about hiring the right person, we would have figured that out by now. It has to be more than that. The organizational response has to be aimed at preventing boundary violations of employees, and it needs to be thoroughly examined by leaders. What are we doing? What are we communicating? What cultural pieces are we giving people that aren't working? And part of that's our code of conduct. A lot of our code of conducts have evolved into a list of rules that if you break, we will fire you. And that's not working. We have lost that general guidance regarding behavior, how we treat each other, how we interact with each other, and how we interact with inmates. And codes of conduct somehow have got to start addressing this variation in boundaries within facilities. Post schedules, and this is an unpleasant topic depending on who I'm talking to, but where do we put the new people? In isolated posts and shifts. They learn their job from inmates. They have to pay their dues, right? We did it and succeeded. First year and a half in the Department of Corrections, I worked with nobody else. I was in a cell house by myself, or at least the first year, I guess. And I succeeded. I didn't have sex with an inmate. I didn't bring in contraband. I certainly had a few faux when it came to emotional mistakes I made. Maybe I spoke too much or around inmates, or they knew too much about me. But we succeeded in the end. We kind of pulled ourselves up, shook ourselves off, and didn't make that mistake again. So this is where we put new people. And then the other thing that's wildly unpopular is rotating staff and inmates. Now, some of us do this depending on the facility, but sometimes we don't really move everybody, whether it's staff or inmates, right? So certainly this rotation can have a piece of it. I'm not saying that's the answer, but it has to be a piece of it. So culture is the issue, and I hated hearing culture change is needed when you're a trainer, because all they sometimes give you is a curriculum. Hopefully you had some input into it, but this idea of changing the culture isn't just about what happens in the classroom. The primary difference, in my opinion, is we have to start talking about the boundary issues, meaning the boundary issues you and I have, the boundary mistakes you and I have made in our career have got to be started part of the conversation, because many successful employees have crossed a boundary. And when we never ever talk about it, what we communicate to the new people, the people that are struggling, the people that didn't figure it out on their own, is that there was something wrong with them. We all figured it out. We didn't have any of these issues. So what's your problem? And when I say let's talk about it, it's not just about gossiping. Let's learn from it. That means the leaders need to get up in front of new people or even seasoned people and talk about boundary mistakes that they have made, or asking other people to talk about boundary mistakes they have made, short of a criminal act, of course. But we need to start taking this kind of out of the shadows. We have to get that unfixable problem I talked about. We have to get, we're asking for help's a real option. We have to get, you know, and I don't know about you, but in Colorado, at one point, we had a video. And a warden was on the video, and basically what he said was, if you are in a situation where you are feeling closer to that inmate than your fellow staff members, for instance, come to us, talk to us, tell us in advance before you crossed a criminal line. Well, nobody bought that. Nobody believed that was really an option. And nobody, by the way, ever did it that I know of. And if they did it, they didn't last very many more years after that, because we never really trusted them again. So how do we get to where asking for help's a real option? Some of the quotes that I have received both in my dissertation work and since then, this one, they still haven't forgiven me. This is from someone who no longer works in corrections, but she does have the audacity to live in the same prison town still that she grew up in. But they still haven't forgiven me. They still change aisles at Walmart when they see me coming. They still won't let their children play with my children. They, goes on and on and on. They still haven't forgiven me. Another one, I cannot even imagine going back to work after saying those words. And those words were, I need help. I think I've crossed a line with an inmate. Even though I haven't crossed a criminal line, I've crossed a line. So I asked this particular person who did not cross a criminal line, but did cross a boundary, why not just tell us and keep going with your career? She had a criminal justice degree, for crying out loud. She was prepared for this. She came from a corrections family. Why not just tell us, ask for help so we could move on instead of resigning and leaving the work? And this was her response. I cannot even imagine going back to work after saying those words. So what we have to do as an organization, and of course training is a piece of that, is we cannot continue to attribute this entire issue to individual failure. I don't ever want to get to the point where individual failure isn't a piece of that, because it certainly is. We certainly have people making very poor choices still. But how do we get past that? How do we move past that to where we're also talking about the culture? We're also talking about where we put people when they're new. What we also are talking about their personal relationship vulnerability, because we all know, because we gossip about it, we all know when someone's going through a divorce, half the time it's because their spouse also works with us, right? So how do we take that information and do something to protect that person, to protect the fallout that we have seen over and over and over again? So I'm going to back up in the PowerPoint slide, so don't get nauseous as I do this, at least I think I'm going to. I want to go back to this list. What can work? So training that addresses the culture and communicated by people outside the classroom. What do you think? Does anyone have any comments on how we actually make this happen? Has anyone had any luck with moving this out of the classroom? How about any questions? Does anyone have any questions or something they want to share with the whole group? Is anybody out there?
I'm out here.
Thank you. All right. Well, you guys are a very quiet group today. Did someone want to say something?
I was kind of wondering if outside of the workplace that where it is working, when you say communicated in daily actions, is more of those frontline supervisors who are moving around the facility and talking to their staff and watching what's happening and kind of coaching them as they're going along.
Absolutely, that's a piece of it, but you don't have to be a frontline supervisor to have people with power, right?
Right. I mean, it could be anybody.
Right. It could be an officer who's been there for 20 years that has more power than maybe even the supervisors. But it's coaching, just what you said. I love that term, coaching, because it really is getting those little mistakes before they become the huge mistakes, right?
Exactly.
How did you and I figure that out? Who's talking?
My name's Amy Lewis.
Amy, so how many years have you worked in corrections?
13.
So how did you figure out where the boundaries are with inmates?
It's a little bit more blunt as far as what I'm dealing with, because I've dealt with just juveniles
Okay.
my entire career. So it's more of a blunt, here is your boundary as far as instead of dealing with adults. So it was very easy for that boundary to be there. Not to say that these boundaries don't get crossed, because it can happen very easily, and I have seen it happen in the past. But it's a little bit more defined when you're dealing with juveniles as opposed to adults.
Okay. And so what you're saying is the expectation of how you communicate with juveniles is much more blunt. It's what I'm hearing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's more defined. It's more defined and blunt due to them being juveniles.
Right, right. And so the idea isn't to catch people doing something wrong with boundaries, but basically it's kind of that. It's kind of catching those small boundary mistakes so you coach them through it. So you can say, you know, this is how we come back from this. This is how you now deal with this. This is how you haul this juvenile, this resident, this inmate into the office and fix this, right?
Exactly.
Those are the learning pieces that we don't trust each other enough to do.
Yes, I can totally see that would be the issue of trusting. I find it easier just if I see something just to stop it right then and there and then coach them and say, hey, this is what this could lead to. You might not want to do this.
Good, good. And everybody has to get on. Now, the reason I talked about trust, I want to tell you guys a story that happened in Colorado again. We had a staff member who had like 12 or 13 years in, they worked in maintenance. And he noticed that one of his maintenance inmates was spending a lot of time in a unit with a new female staff member. And he confronted it. He went to her and said, I'm not sending him over here anymore because I think he's up to no good. And I think he's trying to worm his way into your good graces. And so he didn't. Then she got moved to another facility under the same umbrella of management. And the inmate managed to get moved to that same facility. And a year down the road, I mean, you guys can fill in the story, she was caught having sex with him, I believe, or at least a relationship. When she was caught, among other things, she told the administration that this particular staff member from maintenance knew about it a year ago and covered it up, and he was fired. Now, he did get his job back. It took about $6,000 and about 6 months to fight it to get his job back. But what kind of message does that send? And hopefully none of the rest of you have a story like that. That's my hope, that this is just something, some black eye that Colorado has. But I know from running around the country and talking to people, there are other stories like that. So even though I'm saying communicated by the daily actions of people with power, that's a huge risk, isn't it? Any other comments anybody wants to share with everybody?
Susan, this is Trish Signor.
Hello.
I was in corrections, but now I'm in education.
Yes.
And I have worked in a facility. It was a female facility where we had half a dozen men going around the whole institution having sex. Our staff were having sex with the offenders.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it happens. And what resonated with me was when you said that it's an organizational problem. It's not just the person doing it, but it's just like if you employed all these people and they all quit, you'd have to figure out, what are we doing wrong that we can't keep people on the job? It's the same thing. If people are having sex, there's something in our organization that we should be doing to prevent this, slow it down, whatever. But I just think it's huge, and I think it's everyone's problem. And we should not, just because you don't like a certain staff person, don't push those awkward, odd people away towards the offenders. Be inclusive of them so they don't head in that direction and feel isolated. So I really enjoyed a lot of what you had to say.
Well, and I'm glad you said it like that, those odd people that we push away. You know, I grew up on a Kansas farm. And so for the first 25 years of my career, I said out loud and to myself hundreds of times, how did these inmates keep cutting them from the herd? I couldn't figure out how they kept cutting. Well, what I know, and went back to my farm roots, when a herd discards lives, I'm talking about cattle now, when a herd discards a cow from the group, it's called being culled from the herd. And then that particular cow in this instance, in this analogy, is vulnerable to any predator that comes along, right? And that's what I saw happening in corrections. They weren't being cut from the herd. We were culling them from our herd on a regular basis. And we made them easy pickings for anybody else coming along.
Right.
And again, that's an organizational problem. That's not an individual failure problem, right?
Right.
And that makes us sound like terrible people. I mean, goodness gracious, shouldn't we know better than to push those odd people out, as you put it? But we're human beings. We do that. We do that even though we've got to know that we're making them vulnerable. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, I want to end with just a follow-up from the last webinar I did. If any of you joined me then, I talked about inmate perpetrated harassment against staff. And I told everybody then that the PowerPoints and everything would be available, and they will be very soon in this publication that should be out by the end of March or 1st of April. So very, very soon. And so anyone that joined me with that publication, I'll also send an email follow-up to the particular people that reached out on that. But I wanted to follow up and make sure you knew that this publication is out there or will be very, very soon. It includes training curriculum. It includes, for the most part, the training curriculum I kind of practiced on my audience here, sample policy, a review of litigation, and research. So that concludes our webinar for today. Michael, is there anything we need to follow up on before we conclude?
Sorry, Susan. No, we're good. I will follow up with everybody to provide a link to the recording of today's broadcast and to provide a certificate of attendance.
Great. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? All right. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.